How you doing, guys? So the previews for the upcoming Genshin patch is out, and I can tell you should be very excited to farm the new artifact set. Now there is a new lunar set, but today we're going to focus on this Hexarise set. So what does it do? The 2-piece is 18% attack, which is very nice for most Hexarise characters because they scale off of attack. And then the 4-piece, when you basically just do any attack on an opponent, you get 25% attack increase. Now, considering you're probably using mixed sets on a lot of these Hexarise characters, the 25% attack from that is already more than a 2-piece. So that's already basically an upgrade. But on top of that, if your character has completed Witch's homework, which is what's going to happen if they're a Hexarise character, just go into the Little Witch's dictionary here and make sure you've completed the homework here. And then they will have 20% extra crit rate on top of that. And it works if they're off-field or on-field. So a lot of these characters, they're basically getting 20% extra crit rate for free. This is very modern because a lot of the more recent modern DPS sets are giving you a lot of crit rate, like MH, Obsidian Codex, Knights of the Skies Unveiling. Now, compared to my predictions, which I made months ago, this set is very close. I didn't get the 2-piece right. I guess it's more simple, the attack. But I did get the 20% crit rate right. I definitely wasn't expecting 30-40% crit rate. That would have been way too strong. One thing to note though is this set, unlike your Hexarise talents, it doesn't technically require you to play a Hexarise team. It just requires you to do the Witch's homework. That's in comparison to a lot of the buffs you get on the older characters. So that is very nice because it means you can safely farm it as a permanent set for your character. Anyway, just to get it out of the way, is this set broken or not? Now, this set is strong, but it's not broken. Why? Because even though last patch's Hexarise buffs were very strong, and it made characters like Venti, Klee, Albedo, made these characters borderline meta, but not quite. So actually, in comparison to newer modern Nordcry and Nalin teams, it's fair that they still had quite some room to be improved. And also, one of the things we've been discussing is how, aside from the Mondstadt sub DPSs, most of the DPSs here didn't really have a proper set to use. So I can tell you now, we don't really need to worry about Fischl, Albedo, Sucrose. For sub DPSs, the Golden Troop set is already a modern level artifact set, getting like 70% damage bonus, buffing basically 100% of her damage. Similar thing with Albedo, you can get even the set being over 9-10% worse than Golden Troop. And Albedo is basically the same as Fischl, except if you did farm the Husk set, that's basically the same as Golden Troop. If not, it can even be very slightly better sometimes because the Husk set buffs all his damage. Otherwise, for most people, you just stick with Golden Troop since it was more popular. Just make sure to use a defense goblet on Albedo. And lastly, Sucrose is Sucrose. Whatever set you're using, whether it's VV or even like Deepwood Memories in a modern team, whatever you're using, it ain't going to be the DPS set. So almost everyone at the moment is basically using a mixed set with Klee, except if you're playing her in a Furina team where you're probably using MH. Now, as I talked about in my previous video, Klee scales extremely hard with crit rate, and we're looking at an overall 16, 18, sometimes even 20% damage increase for the new set. This is massive. Remember, those of you who have been playing Klee, I'm sure you've already been pretty happy with a team like this. So making her significantly stronger arguably straight up makes her pretty meta relevant now, especially if you have her strong C1 or C2. So how long will it take you to get an upgrade? Remember, 18% is basically equivalent to 8 or 9 substats. But bear in mind, if you're using mixed sets like this by now, especially if you have got an old account, you've probably got some insane pieces, so it might still take you a few weeks to a few months to form a better set. 7 to 10 substats of an upgrade is no joke. Let's say you have a 34 substat Klee with a mixed set. That might mean all you need is a 25 substat set to start being an upgrade, which is basically you get 2 artifacts for free. Now, considering you can always transfer an off piece between sets, getting a 25, 26 substat set should not take a long time, and you can even craft a new piece if you want. It's also cool to know that the new set is basically equal to MH in Furina teams, since if you remember, we calculated Marechaussee Hunter as also around a 15-20% increase in a team like this, sometimes even slightly higher depending on how much attack you lack. But what that means is if it's equal to MH in a team like this, that gives you even more incentive to farm the new set, because you can freely decide whatever team you want to play Klee on. Do you want to play here with Furina? Do you want to play on an overload team? Whatever team you want to play on. A massive upgrade, or at worst, side grade. So how does this impact Klee's meta? One thing it impacts is that Klee had several options that were close to overload damage wise. You could even play Nod Cry, Lunar Charge type teams with Inefa. You could even play burning teams with Emily. But a lot of these non-overload teams, they were very reliant on Klee having actual sets in these teams. Like I said, if you were playing Klee in a Furina team, a lot of that damage benefit that you get playing her with Furina was using MH. Same thing with Emily. A lot of the benefit you get by playing Emily was that Klee gets to use Unfinished Reverie, and with Inefa being able to use the new Nod Cry set. But overload teams, whether you were playing Durin or Bennett, these teams were still maybe slightly better overall, but without a set. So they were basically handicapped. But now that Klee is getting a 15 to 20% damage increase in these overload teams, it affects the meta, because her overload teams now should just blast past the other teams. Another thing you might be wondering is, how much does this 15-20% damage increase translate into team DPS? It depends on how much your Klee is doing compared to the rest of your team. And this is where the debate of playing Bennett versus Durin does get extremely close, since Klee does more of the team's damage share with Bennett. However, to sum it up, I can still tell you Durin will still be more recommended overall, especially if your Durin is well invested, because Durin can even use the new set. And remember, the new set, it can even work if your character is off field. But let's talk about Durin. Now for off-field Durin, here are some of the calcs I have. And overall, you might notice that the team damage wise with C0 Klee, all the set variations are basically the same. So Durin doesn't necessarily benefit from the new set existing as an off-fielder, because in teams with 3 damage dealers, you do benefit quite a lot by having a lot of buffs going around. Now I know a lot of people have been using Noblesse on him because it buffs the team a lot. However, in a lot of teams you do use his burst early, which means the uptime on your attack buffs can be pretty poor, which is why Noblesse isn't essential in a lot of teams. As such, as a general recommendation, I would say it's worth getting him off Noblesse, because it will make your teams more flexible. You can use Durin whenever you want. But with both buffing sets, Klee's damage in a calc is about 4% higher. So if you have Klee's constellations, the older sets will probably scale better with investment. But that also depends on your Durin investment. Do you have his weapon? Maybe you have an early constellation. So judge accordingly. I would say you can't go wrong with any of these. Now when it comes to Durin on field, I think most people will be interested in seeing how it compares with MH in Furina teams, because a team like this is probably how you're playing him. And it's similar to Klee. The new set, it will be pretty much a side grade, maybe even a downgrade for a while, because you've been farming MH for a while. Honestly, unfortunately, I know a lot of people have been having issues playing Durin on field because it's a bit scuffed, try not to get staggered, and maybe you miss some vapes, and Durin's uptime in Bennett's burst can be pretty low. So I know most people stick to playing him off field. And without Bennett's burst, you're not getting those pyro infused basic attacks. But if you are playing Durin on field, generally speaking, the new set isn't gonna be much more DPS than MH, because MH already does give modern levels of crit rate. However, this is just looking at things in a vacuum, because MH gives 36% crit rate and the new set only gives 20. It has less of its power budget in crit rate, which can make this set more viable long term, because with MH and 5-star weapons like Jade Cutter or whatever you're using, you're probably close to overcapping on crit rate with Durin, which can make it difficult to have an insane build. And honestly, I also just recommend farming overall for Durin, because similar to Klee, it is a one-stop shop artifact set. You farm this set for Durin and it will work whether you're playing him on field or off field. I should also say though, if you do farm it, you're also not as reliant on Furina. Maybe you can do stuff like this and get more consistent vapes with Durin. Now let's move on to Mona, because Mona is also interesting. It does depend how exactly you're playing her. If you're playing Mona at lower constellations or in more of a driver role to let Durin vape instead, maybe in a playstyle more like this, where you use darkness mode Durin, and then you apply hydro to let Durin get as much damage as possible. Something like this, then you can actually still keep Mona on Noblesse, to be honest. And that's because you're going to want to min-max your Durin's buffs. You'll give Durin the new set to maximize his damage, but then you've got room to give Bennett Instructor instead of Noblesse. Shilonen can use the scroll set, but maybe you're not playing Shilonen. Maybe you're playing Furina. Well, Furina can still use the Tenacity set. If you're playing neither of them, you're playing Sucrose. Sucrose can still use VV. So you can keep Mona on to still buff Durin as much as possible. Now, however, if you're a Giga Chad and maybe you've got C6 Mona, unlike me, and you're using Durin to vape your Mona's damage, then there's a very big chance Mona is getting a big buff. Now, just some rough calcs, for example, I've got the new set compared to a random mix set, 16% increase, so basically the same thing as Klee. And that makes sense because the new set will actually buff all of Mona's damage, especially in comparison to older sets like Heart of Depth, which this actually doesn't buff Mona's burst. I also want to talk about Nymph's Dream. I'm actually getting quite underperforming. You might be surprised with that, but the thing is with Nymph's Dream is theoretically it does have some nice buffs, gives you the same attack as the new set, but it gives you hydro damage instead of crit. The problem with this is as some of you guys may already know, when buffs require you to hit in order to get those buffs, the hit that you do to get that doesn't actually get the buff. So sets like this requiring several different hits to get multiple layers of stacks, it does mean Mona has several hits that just don't have that many buffs. So, and then you either have to spend time doing a setup or you have to just sacrifice some of the damage. And unfortunately, Mona isn't a bow character like Child or Venti who can stack up her buffs super quickly. If you want to do a charge attack, very slow. Also, another thing about Heart of Depth set is Mona is very oversaturated on damage percent buffs. Omen gives a lot of damage bonus. She also has this hydro damage bonus conversion here. A lot of your teammates like Shilonen, Furina also getting a ton of damage percent. Mona will just have so much damage percent in these teams that in my calcs, Heart of Depth here giving 30% extra to normals and charges, that isn't not even that much of an increase, and then you're losing damage on the burst. That's why it's just kind of mid, on top of it just being an older set. So definitely farm the newer set. There's no need to talk about Drazer because he's going to be very similar to Klee and Durin, where it's a very nice upgrade. But the last character I'm going to talk about is Venti. And the reason I've put Venti here is because technically you can already use an unpopular set on him, which is that even though most players are probably using a random mix set on Venti, if you are a Wanderer player or maybe you were farming for Kokomi back in the day, you might have been using Desert Pavilion Chronicle on Venti. And this, although it didn't buff his burst, it gives a lot of buffs to his normals and it even gives you attack speed. Now, because of that, even though the new set does buff his burst, it's not really much better theoretically than Desert Pavilion. But not only does very few people have Desert Pavilion, but because you need to do a charge attack on Desert Pavilion, because whenever you switch to Venti, you have to make sure to do that aim shot. At least you don't have to charge fully, but you still have to do an aim shot there before you start attacking on Venti. But one issue with the new Rising Wind set is if using a crit rate weapon. Like for example, I'm using Skyward Harp. It's very easy if you're using a crit rate circlet to be very close to overcapping. And to be fair, a lot of bows do give crit rate. So one of the issues with that is if you're having to rebalance your build, maybe you're having to reduce the amount of crit rates and swap in some attack, trading crit rate stats for attack stats, then it's not going to be that much of an upgrade. But if you're able to not waste crit stats, like you're trading 10% crit rate for 20% crit damage, or you just got such a good build, if I add the 20% crit rate on top of this, I'm only at 90. And once you've got a very good build like that, then the new set is getting to that Klee, to that Durin level, 14, 15, 16% damage increases over the mix set, and then it's very nice. But even though I say that, again, similar story to Durin, you might as well just farm it on Venti because it's universal and there's no point farming old sets. Now, of course, we should talk about future Hexarite characters upcoming, like Nicole, Alice, maybe even Varka. I think everyone can expect more future characters than just Durin to work with the new set. Now, balancing wise, what will happen is that they will balance future characters with this set in mind. So even though this set is insanely strong on old characters, that's only because older characters never really got access to stats like this unless you play them in specific teams. But even though it's insane for older characters, newer characters, it will just be assumed you have it. And that already kind of adds up, where for Durin, no matter which playstyle you're using him in, it's not going to be as big of an upgrade as the older characters. So again, it goes back to my initial point. In the grand scheme, this set isn't really broken overall, but it also means it's safe to farm because there will be a lot of use cases. Even if you're not using an older DPS right now, like maybe you're not a big fan of Venti or Klee, you might want it in the future for a future Hexarite DPS or even an off-fielder. This set is just so flexible. I will be shocked if an account doesn't have a use case for this. So overall, I'm very happy with the new set. Me personally, I'm going to be spending a lot of time farming there. And I'm especially happy that even though I was already happy with like Venti's buffs or Klee's buffs, I'm happy that they didn't just leave them at that. They remembered that some of the characters don't have signature sets. And this overall just makes me more excited for more buffs in the future because it shows that they are taking care of old characters. So you can look forward to farming this set from the new artifact domain in Ashvale Peak of Nodcry. And hopefully you found this video helpful. Thanks for watching, guys.